Welcome to Wine Country at Work. I'm Ralph de Amicis, your host today. As a tour guide, I go into tasting rooms all the time, and I'm many times introducing my guests to Wine Tasting 101. See, most people, they'll go to restaurants, they'll go to a bar, they'll have a glass of wine, they get to know the wine a bit, but that's very different from going to a tasting room. A tasting room is an opportunity to try wine side by side, and then go to another winery and try wine side by side again. And each place you go, the wines are different. And why this is important is that, you see, taste is not controlled by the conscious mind. Taste is controlled by the limbic system, the deeper parts of the mind. It's the part that's related to emotions. And that part of the brain, just like emotions, never forgets a flavor or a scent. So as you taste your way through tasting rooms, you build up a bigger and bigger library of flavors that later on, when you're drinking wines, you're going to bring that to bear. So after a weekend of wine tasting, next time you go into a restaurant and you have a glass of wine, it's going to taste very different to you because your body has read more deeply in this subject. Okay? Now, when people are tasting and see they do certain things, and it's not meant to be snobbish, it's about allowing your body to really appreciate and understand the wines. And many times people will say, and it's quite true, that the wine always tastes better at the winery. And that's partly because you're in the environment. You're in a place where all we talk about is food, wine, and weather. So of course you're going to enjoy it more because that's what you're focused on. But it's also because many times the glasses are better. Wineries are very careful in the wine glass that they choose. You see, these are not glass, these are crystal. And if you looked under a microscope, you would see that they're quite rough on the surface. Glass is perfectly smooth, but crystal is quite rough. And the idea is that when you pour the wine in there, all through the winemaking experience, all through the process, they have worked very hard to keep that wine away from oxygen. And the reason is, once the oxygen gets there, the flavors are going to start releasing. And they don't want the flavors releasing. They want them to hang in there until they arrive in your glass. And then they can release. And so these glasses are designed to release these flavors. Okay? Now, many years ago when I was young, we had very small wine glasses. And over the years, they've gotten bigger and bigger. Why? That's the fault of the Americans. We Americans did it. Know why? Because we have wonderful growing conditions in California. We have a very long growing season. It allows us to keep the grapes on the vine for a very long time. And when you do that, the sugar levels get higher and higher and higher. And when the yeast goes to work on it and it converts it into alcohol, the alcohol goes higher and higher and higher too. The reason for these big glasses is that it allows more space for the alcohol to come off of the wine and for you to get your nose underneath there and smell the fruit. You don't want to smell the alcohol. Many times you see people smelling the wine up here. All they're smelling really, or 80% of what they're smelling, is the alcohol. You want to smell the fruit. To do that, you hold the glass sideways. You hold it up sideways across your body. Why do you hold it sideways? Because that way if you spill it, because you are drinking wine all day, it doesn't end up on here, right? Put your nose by the bottom side of the glass, and professionals will put their nose right in the glass. Okay, you don't have to do that. It's okay. But you can tell the professionals during a big wine tasting because all our noses are red by the end of the day. And then you take a little sniffs. It's very important to realize that the nose is a major portion of the wine experience. The nose will pick up about 2,200 different scents, where the palate only picks up about 5 to 6 flavors. Now, you can make a lot of different music out of 5 to 6 notes, but it's still only 5 to 6 flavors, and there's a lot of variation. The typical wine, they have hundreds of flavors, and if you look about the total number of flavors that are found in wines, there's about 1,000 flavors. Compared this to about 300 or 400 for coffee. Wines are very, very complex, but it's the nose, those 2,200, 2,400 different scents that it picks up. It will read a tremendous amount And it tells you about that wine. It informs you about that wine. Now, when you go into the tasting room, they're going to pour tastings. They're going to pour small amounts. And the average pour is about an ounce. Now, sometimes you have to watch out. If you go into a private tasting, it's a sit-down tasting, they can get a little heavy-handed there. They might go up to 2 ounces per glass. Well, if they're pouring 4 wines in the course of a tasting and it's an ounce per glass, that's basically a 4-ounce glass of wine in the tasting. If you're going to do 2 or 3 of those in a day, you're going to be drinking 3 to 4 glasses of wine in the day. If they're pouring a lot more, they can really load you up. When you go with a tour guide, you have to watch out, someone who's driving you, because they'll know that you're not driving, and they can start getting a little heavy-handed there, so watch out for that. That's why they have tasting buckets there, the dump buckets. And feel free to dump the wine out, okay? Feel free to share a tasting if you're there with your honey. The wineries never, or very rarely, will ever mind if you share a tasting or if you dump the wine out. Why? Because they don't want drunks showing up at the end of the day. They want you to taste the wine and enjoy it because they want you to buy it. And if it starts all tasting the same to you, why would you buy there? You can go to some big box store and get the wine more cheaply. In truth, realize that what they sell in the stores many times is not what they sell in the wineries. You see, the wineries keep the best wines to sell at the winery, and they sell the very best wines to their wine club. So if you see a big brand and there's a label out there and you see it in the store all the time, realize that that's the wine that they get the grapes the most cheaply, and they typically push them out there to establish their brand. Now, this isn't true with the super high-end wines, the Joseph Phelps, the Quintessas. Those wines you see in restaurants, those are their best grapes, are their maybe almost best grapes. Probably if you look under Mr. Phelps's desk, you'll find the really best grapes, but then you got to know the right person. So when they pour the tasting, right, they're going to pour about an ounce. The ideal thing is that, and I'm not really expert at this, but you should be able to put the glass sideways like this. And it should stay inside the glass when you do that. That's not so bad. Now, when you first pour it in, okay, before you swirl it, put your nose on there, angled, and take a little sniff. Why? There's a concept called the corked wine. This is due to a bacterium that's found in corks. It's a nasty little thing. It doesn't destroy the wine, but what it does do is it gives the flavor of, or the smell of a wet newspaper. It's not pleasant. It happens every now and then. It's one of the reasons why many people like to use, twist tops. You can't cork a wine if you're not using a cork. Over the years, they've improved corks dramatically, and it is much more rare than it used to be, but it still happens. So by doing this, if the scent is there from the cork, it will show up right there, and this wine clearly is not corked. Now, before you take a serious sip, you're going to want to swirl it. And I'm using the larger glass here, partially because I'm using a red wine for this. Give it a good swirl, and you swirl it down here on the countertop. No why? First of all, you're going to get a better swirl. If you're swirling up here, it's hard to really get a good swirl, and besides the fact that you have to see if your dry cleaners has a really good sense of humor after a while. If you swirl down here, that's not going to be an issue. By the way, don't wear white or light colors when you're wine tasting if you can avoid it. And then you bring it to your nose. Like I said, turn it a little sideways. Put your nose at the bottom edge and take a sip. Oh my, isn't that nice? And then nice. What you want to do is make sure that the juice gets all over your tongue. There's different sensors in different places. At the tip of the tongue is the sweet spot. It recognizes the sweet right away. In fact, there's actually glasses that have been designed. They come up and they create a little flute at the top. Why? They were designed for the Pinots from Oregon that have very high acid levels. That high acid was stinging the tongue, so they created that little acid bump to bring the juice around the side of the tongue so you wouldn't get that little zinger. Nowhere else it works really great. It works great on champagnes. Why? Because champagnes have very high acid levels. They're sparkly. They're a cold climate grape that's grown in a place that gets very cool at night, that maintains high acid levels. You see, the plant will dump the acid out at night if it can, but if it goes too cool, the plant goes dormant, and then it can't dump the acid out. That's the key to a good wine grape, a good wine region. It has to be very hot and dry during the day. Dry basically protects it from mold. Hot and sunny gives it a chance to make lots and lots of sugar to turn into alcohol. And then cool at night so the plant can't dump out the acid. If it can dump the acid out, then you get what's called a flabby wine. And there is no situation where the word flabby is meant as a compliment. Now, you're going to swirl this again, sniff again, sip again. And what they do is they give you quite a bit in the glass. And one of the reasons is they give you enough that you can really swirl it. If they give you too little, you're not going to be able to really swirl it and really swirl it. See how I have my nose right there at the bottom edge? That way the alcohol is coming out up here, the fumes. My nose is down there and I'm really recognizing those flavors. Okay? Now here's the cool thing. This is interesting. If you swirl to the left, you're going to get more of the flavor of the barrel. If you swirl to the right, you're going to get more of the flavor of the fruit. And this will be most evident, of course, in grapes that have been in barrels, especially new barrels, for a long period of time. Now, why this happens has to do with how vortexes function, in which way particles are carried, and how the barrel flavor is placed on the molecule. It's a little wine geeky. We're going to not get into that because it really doesn't matter for most cases. But if you have a really good nose, you will notice the difference. And besides, it's fun. You're exploring the wine. You want to see what these flavors are about. Why not try different ways? Another thing you can do is hold the wine there and then bring your glass, your nose to the top of the glass and then bring it down lower. You'll notice those flavors will change. And like I said with the juice, really let it get all over the palate because it's going to really affect different things. The only place it doesn't tend to get to is at the back of the throat, because at the back of the throat are the bitters. And wine typically doesn't have bitters, so you can taste wines quite effectively and spit them out, and professionals do. In Napa and Sonoma, it's pretty rare to see people who are on vacation doing that, but professionals do it. What's funny is that you can't do that with beer. You can't taste and then spit the wine out, spit the beer out. And the reason is, some of the most important flavors in beer are the bitters. So you're spitting the best part out before you ever have a chance to experience it. So, swirl, sniff, sip, and then repeat the process. Once again, try swirling different directions. And make sure you're holding it sideways. You put your nose above there, you'll notice that all of a sudden it feels like, in comparison, like someone's holding a napkin in front of your nose. Like suddenly you just can't smell the wine suddenly. It kind of, the flavors disappear. So that's the basics of it. Now, in a tasting, they're going to start off with a white typically, and they're going to go to a lighter red, and then a darker red, and finally whatever their most popular wine is, or their biggest, most expensive wine is. And that's a way in which your palate can kind of work its way up from simpler flavors to more complex flavors. It's also because these big reds stick themselves to your palate. So make sure that in between tastings, you eat something to clean that palate off, scrape it off, so you have a little bit more room on there to try the next wine. So that's Wine Tasting 101. I hope you enjoyed it.
Wait.
The wind is just blowing?
Yeah, it's blowing great. It's so quick. It's so...
Wind sail. Hi, Ralph de Amicis again for Wine Country at Work. I'm going to explain a little bit about grapes. And we're talking wine grapes. We're not talking about table grapes here, because up here in wine country, we don't grow table grapes. See, a table grape is a big ball of juice. Lots and lots of water. A wine grape is a little grape with lots and lots of skin. And the reason is, the skin is where all the flavor is. And in fact, if they irrigate too much, what happens is you end up with a big ball of juice, and you get a wine without any really kind of structure. So it's very important that the different regions are good for different purposes. Now, the North Bay wine region where we live, which is Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, Lake County, is very remarkable in the wine world. And that's because of the diversity. You see, if you're a winemaker in Burgundy, France, you're going to spend most of your life making wine from 5 or 6 grapes. You know, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, Chardonnay, maybe some Moscato, Pinot Blanc. Those are the grapes that grow there. It's very regimented, but it's also because that particular climate supports those grapes very well. If you live in Bordeaux, well, you're making Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, right? Malbec, Merlot, Petit Verdot. Those are your reds. And then you make your Sauvignon Blanc and your Semillon. Maybe you make some Tannat. Tannat is a big, rich, heavily tannin wine. That's pretty much what you got to work with. Once again, it's very regulated, it's very standardized, and that's what grows well there. Between Napa and Sonoma, we grow probably between 125 and 150 different kinds of grapes. That's remarkable. Why? We call it microclimates. We have all these tiny little climates. We have all these little areas of different geology. I mean, Napa alone, the Napa Valley, which is only 30 miles wide, long and 5 miles wide, has more than half of all the soil types in the world in our little microcosm here. If you start in the southern part of Carneros, Los Carneros, the sheep, right by the bay, it's very cool. But as you travel up the valley, it gets warmer and warmer and warmer, almost a degree per mile. So you can be 60 degrees down in Carneros, and all the way at the top of the valley in Calistoga, it can be 90 degrees at the same time. Down in the Bay area, they're growing, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, the grapes of Burgundy. Up at the top, they're growing, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, the grapes of Bordeaux, even the grapes of Croatia, Zinfandel. Years ago, they used to grow a tremendous amount of Zinfandel at the top of the valley. This is all in the same 30 miles. As a result, winemakers come from all over the world to work here. Why? Because it's like being a chef. Imagine you were a chef and you spent your entire life working with salt, pepper, mustard, and ketchup, and maybe some cayenne, some red pepper. And suddenly they let you into a restaurant and they say, okay, we have 150 different spices. Oh my gosh. It's like you've died and gone to heaven. That's why winemakers love coming here. And so we have winemakers from France, from Australia, from Italy, from all over the world, really. And it makes for a really interesting community. Now, depending upon where you are, certain grapes will dominate. And Napa, which is the most famous, of course, is famous for its Cabernet, Cabernet Sauvignon. It's also well known for Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Malbec, Petit Verdot. Those are the classic 5 red varietals from Bordeaux. Now, why 5? Well, basically, these are the grapes that they grow that worked well in Bordeaux that they could blend well. You see, they have a shorter growing season from us. So they would get caught out by the fact that, this year or that year, one grape or another would do better or worse, right? And maybe it would rain during harvest, or maybe it would get, hail during the flowering or something. They would have to blend back and forth to get a wine that was well balanced. It's what you got to do. In Napa, we get good conditions usually 7 years out of 10. In Bordeaux, you get good conditions 2 years out of 10. And we have a very long growing season, so it's very easy for us to get our grapes fully ripe most years. So where in Bordeaux, it's very rare they would, sell 100% Cabernet Sauvignon or even 100% Merlot. We routinely do that. Though many of the Cabernet Sauvignons that people have here are actually 75% Cabernet, but then maybe 25% Merlot or a little bit of Malbec or something to round out the flavor. See, Cabernet Sauvignon is a very popular grape here for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a big producer. It will outproduce most other grapes, which the growers, of course, love. 2, it commands a very high price. Now, big production, high price. If I was a grower in Napa, I'd probably be growing Cabernet Sauvignon. The other thing about it, it has a very thick skin, which makes it very resistant to bugs, to birds, to rain, to whatever. Okay? The challenge with it is that that thick skin means that the sun has to work very hard to go through that skin to make enough sugar. But here in Napa, we don't have just sunshine. We have multiple levels of sunshine. And this is on the Weather Channel. We have sunny days. We have plentiful sunshine. We have plenty of sunshine. And then we have abundant sunshine. That's the day when you need your hat, your darkest sunglasses, and you look for the shade. Well, it's fantastic for grapes, especially Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, the next big grape after that is Merlot. Now, I think that one of the reasons Merlot became so popular, besides the fact that it's a lovely tasting wine, is the fact that it's easy to say, Merlot. You know, you're in a bar, you want to order a glass of wine, you want to impress the girl you're with, you can say, hey, give me a Merlot. I'm not going to have a Bud tonight, I'm going to have a Merlot. See, I'm sophisticated. It's a lot easier to say than, give me a Cabernet Sauvignon something or other, right? Or give me a Gewürztraminer or something like that, you know. We say that's the Sonoma sobriety test. If you can't say Gulak Bunchu Gewürztraminer, then you're too drunk to drive, right? But that's one of the reasons I think Merlot became so popular. Besides, it's a big, fruity, comfortable wine. It doesn't have a lot of tannin. Tannins many times will give people headaches. Tannin requires a wine to be aged a long time, so you can turn that Merlot around faster. Now, there's other wines that are very important that are part of that. Malbec. Malbec is becoming more and more popular. Of course, most people know their Malbec from Argentina. They've kind of made it their grape. And Cabernet Franc. It's a grape very similar to Cabernet Sauvignon, but the skin is thinner. And then there's the white version of the Bordeaux, which is Sauvignon Blanc. Now, why am I bringing all these up? Because what I'm talking about here is basically the family. You see, Cabernet Sauvignon is the child of Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Franc. These two vines were beside each other in the vineyards, and they got a little collusion going on, a little cross-pollination there, and they developed what was called a clone, and that was Cabernet Sauvignon, developed several hundred years ago, and it will outproduce the other grapes. In Bordeaux, if you're over on one bank, many of the times they'll say, well, the grape's primarily Cabernet Sauvignon. In truth, it's mostly Cabernet Franc. They have a shorter season. They don't have quite as much sun as long of the year. So the Cabernet Franc will ripen a little bit, or they'll fill in with the Cabernet Sauvignon. If you're on the other bank, it's mostly Merlot. And that's kind of the little hidden secret that people think of, they used to have simply the Bordeaux blends. Depending upon what side of the river you're on, it's either Merlot or it's the Cabs. Okay. What's interesting is that the most famous vineyards in Bordeaux are actually planted on reclaimed land that was reclaimed by the Dutch back in the 1700s. See, Napa is very different. We're just blessed. Luther Burbank, the great botanist, said that of all the places on the planet, he felt that this was the area most blessed by nature. And considering that, they really have not done much to change Napa, it's amazing the conditions we have. The temperature levels are just about perfect. But Napa does not live here in a splendid solitude. Right across the mountains, across the Mayacamas Mountains, is Sonoma. And Sonoma is actually twice as big as Napa. It's a big county. It's part of what's called the Redwood Empire. It's filled with redwood trees. It has a big ocean coast. It has multiple regions, including the Sonoma Valley, where they grow a wide variety of grapes. They have our Carneros district, just like Napa, where they grow the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir, the grapes of Burgundy. And then in the north, they have the Russian River Valley, where it's all Pinot and Chardonnay. It's very cool. And probably many of the best Pinots in the country come from that region. It's rather remarkable. Then just north of there, a few minutes, is the Dry Creek Valley, which is famous for its Zinfandel, which is a classically Californian grape, even though it's not from California originally, but we have made it ours, after all. And then you go over the hills from there, and you're in the Alexander Valley, where they grow primarily Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, very much like Napa, and yet with a difference. They're much softer flavors. The tannins are not quite as heavy. The flavors are a little rounder, a little gentler. So Sonoma is its own world. And in truth, if the northern part of Sonoma around Healdsburg, which includes the Dry Creek Valley, the Russian River Valley, Alexander Valley, if that was as close to San Francisco as Napa was, or as Napa is, it would be just as busy because it's a remarkable area. Napa has the huge advantage of being barely an hour from San Francisco, as does the Sonoma Valley. These are the number 1 and number 2 top wine destinations in the world, in part because of proximity, in part because of, the great American love of tourism and hospitality. We are innovators after all, and I actually have winemakers come here from all over the world to learn how we do our hospitality. And I think it's because Americans, as winemakers, don't take ourselves too seriously. It's not our grandfather and great-grandfather and great-grandfather and great-great-great-great, that have been telling you, you've got to make wine your whole life. Many of the people who are here came to it from, technology or from factories or from banking or from sales or, a couple of excellent winemakers, the makers of Coaster Brown. They came out of restaurants. They loved great food. They loved great wine. They said, we should make some of this. Hey, it's not rocket science. 90% of making good wine is keeping things really clean, washing things. That's 90% of winemaking. About 9% of it is about really good paperwork because you have to keep very good records. 1% of it is the fun part, which is, the blending, trying the different parts of the wine, blending it together. And what's really cool about that is that when you come to a tasting room, you get to try the part that is the most fun without all of the work. But sounds good to me. So I hope that gives you some insights about the different varietals that grow here, why the region is the way it is. And I hope it encourages you to come visit and stay a while and try some of these wonderful wines. To your health. It's amazing how many great sparkling wines we grow here. And we don't call them champagne. We're much too polite for that. But they are the sparkling wines. What's very interesting is how many of them are owned by European companies. Cordonu from Spain makes their cava. They own the Artesa winery. Domaine Carneros is owned by Taittinger, another great champagne house. Domaine Chandon is Moet Hennessy. Now, we also have our American-born Schramsberg, for instance. The original winery was owned by Schramm, but was restored over years by the Davies family, and they decided to make sparkling wines. And they make wonderful sparkling wines. It was a Schramsberg wine that Nixon brought to China when he normalized relations there. So there's wonderful wines. Most of those are grown primarily along the Carneros district, where they grow the Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, which is what most sparkling wines are made from. And because it requires a very cool climate to have a nice crisp flavor in the grapes.